Cyfalter of panel eintalk again, I imagine. So this is the discussion standing shoulder to shoulder against racism. We had a bigger crowd here before the choir here, but the Protestants stole all the people and took them upstairs. I gotta go upstairs and talk about Uniting Ireland. We'll hopefully touch on that a bit ourselves. So got an excellent panel today: Stiofán Ó Nualláin, Twassul Mohammed, and Dr. Azadeh Sobout. We'll just go around and let everybody do introductions themselves. I'll start with myself. My name is Dessie Donnelly. I work for Rabble Co-Operative. It's a technology cooperative based in Belfast, and I suppose the last couple of years we've been working on monitoring anti-immigrant networks across social media and online, and I've been working with Twasul on developing a monitoring tool for people who are subjected to racist attacks to collect data on the police response themselves to try to hold police and structures accountable. But maybe if we start yourself, Stiofán, and just go through just who you are, what you're doing.
Please go on my get to one morning and for the being short listening you and especially the father and there's Gheimhridh for a couple of laugh. Gary preached the show free age with my name's Stiofán Ó Nualláin. I'm Stevie. I work for Trademark Belfast. We're part of the Irish labour movement, established way back in the 90s as an organisation called Counteract, merged into Trademark. Trademark's been around for 25 years. Actually probably a new job by now. Too long. Trademark's initial work was workplace intervention in the context of systemic abuse and intimidation. Did a lot of work with paramilitary mediation and working with ex-prisoner groups. In 2008, we kind of fell into delivering political education within the labour movement, particularly in Ireland, Britain, and also in Europe. And then more recently, of course, with the rise of populism and the far right and fascism, everyone's rightly panicking, and our work has increased exponentially, being invited in to talk about these subjects that we're going to talk about today in the labour movement, and hopefully get a chance to tell you a bit more detail about what it is we do.
Thanks, Stiofán. Twasul?
My name is Twassul Mohammed. I am a refugee from Sudan, and I work at Participation and the Practice of Rights. PPR, a few people in the room here are working with me in PPR. And it's a human rights campaigning organization, and we run a few campaigns around housing, right to work, new script for mental health. I work with a campaign that supports refugees and asylum seekers. It's called Lift the Ban, Kind Economy. I started with PPR 5 years ago, and I worked in a few campaigns, but most of my work has been to support refugees and asylum seekers, bring them in the campaigns and help them with different issues they are facing.
Brilliant. Twasul, thank you.
گرمایگت جیدش اسمش آزاده is as Iran me. Gurmayget for organizing this event, and it's an honor to be able to speak here today. I'm an Iranian activist, writer, scholar, currently a postdoc fellow in Queen's University of Belfast, but also very much on the ground with campaigns and communities over the past 12 years.
Brilliant. Okay, so a lot of experience on the panel. I thought we'll probably talk for hours. Fargo, we planned to end this at noon. This one at noon. Okay, so we've got about 45 minutes. We'll probably have a discussion ourselves for about 30 minutes, and then open up the floor if there's any questions or any other topics that haven't been covered you want us to cover a bit more. What I'd like to do is kind of really look at the whole issue of the growth of the far right in terms of the causes, the impact on migrant communities, the reasons behind their growth, and then also what responses have been, and maybe looking at next steps as well. So I thought I'd just kind of start off asking Twasul maybe. I know the summer work you've been doing has been working with kind of asylum seekers, first in Marine Court Hotel in Bangor, more recently in Chimney Corner, but you also work with migrant families living in communities that have been subjected to racist attacks. So I suppose kind of looking at the whole issue, the growth of the far right and racism, that doesn't happen in a vacuum. You know, it happens in the context of racist laws, racist policies, the failure of the police and other bodies to respond appropriately when racist attacks happen. Can you maybe just sort of kick us off with some of the experiences, the communities you were working with? Go through.
Yeah. Yeah, of course, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and of course, it's being encouraged by all the racism that is coming from the states, like their statements, the media, the words they are using. And for me, someone who came recently to Belfast, I can see the difference. I came 9 years ago, and when I came, I thought Belfast is very welcoming. I thought there was racism, and I met many people who were victims of racism. My experience has been really, really good, but through the years, I can see the change now, and it happened so quickly. Like the work in the Marine Court was part of our work in the hotels generally. Like when the Home Office started accommodating asylum seekers in hotels in 2021, and this was supposed to be for quarantine only for 2 weeks during COVID, but then I think someone realized that it's bringing a lot of money, and they just continued with it, and it's kind of saved hotel owners at that time, because they were using more than 21 hotels across Northern Ireland, and these hotels were paid for full occupancy, even if you had like 6 or 10 asylum seekers in the hotel. So they went on with it against all policies that say you can't place families, for example, in emergency accommodation for more than 6 weeks. Some families stayed in these hotels for more than a year. So the work in Marine Court started as part of that. We were supporting families and single men in hotels with different issues they are having. It started as a housing issue because we were working with the housing campaign. So we started getting reports from people who living in hotels with different problems. They're having so many problems, starting from they were given inappropriate food because people are coming from the Middle East or Africa, and they are given local food, which people find strange, and especially for kids, because like adults can force themselves to eat anything, but with kids it was difficult, and we got reports of kids losing weight and pregnant women getting anemic because of the food. We had public resident meetings with the hotels because at some point it became like so many people were trying to support, and we couldn't do this one by one. So we held these meetings in a Redeemer Church in Donegal Street, and people started coming to us because they heard of the meetings. So when the protests started in front of Marine Court, we got single men, some of them who stayed in that hotel, coming and like complaining about the protests. And they were talking about the change they have seen in Bangor too. They were saying like when they first came to the hotel, people in the street were kind and nice and mostly helped them. But then when the protests started, they started to see the change in the streets. Like they got more harassment in the street. A few of them got beaten up in the street. Harassment in the gym. Asylum seekers at the time got free membership to the gym. So people will harass them in the gym and tell them that they're taking all the money, all the benefit, all the stuff you hear of. We work with these boys, and we wrote a lot of complaints for them with all the problems they're having, because the protests were happening weekly, and all mayors and the Home Office and the local authorities there were doing was telling the boys to stay in. So they were trapped in the hotel while the protests were happening, and the police didn't have enough presence, even though everyone was pushing and putting pressure on the police to do that. Like we met with Stephen Farry and different people in Bangor to ask the police to do something. So all the police was doing is coming, standing in front of the hotel and telling people not to leave. So they are the victims, but they are being asked to stay as prisoners instead of stopping people who were protesting outside. And people were asked to stay in because it's not just a peaceful protest. Like they're not protesting, saying things, and people can just walk by. People were in danger. Like whenever they walk out, they might get beaten by the protesters outside. So we worked with them for a while, like trying to work with the community in Bangor. We met with churches, with art centers, tried to find places for them to go. Some people were really, really helpful, and there's an art center just beside the hotel, and they opened their space to the young men, welcomed them, they told them they are welcome to go there for the events, gave them tickets and all, and also gave us the space to meet with them and talk about the different issues. But because we all know that racism in the north of Ireland is not just ordinary citizens being racist or just protesting, but it involves the far right too. So at some point, even people in Bangor who were trying to help were scared. Like many places told us that they wanted to help, but they can't afford getting their windows smashed. So that was part of it. And now we are, did I go too long?
No, you can keep going there. Well, I mean, we'll just stop there for a second because we're getting into the whole picture of it. But, you know, you said 9 years ago it changed when you came.
Yeah.
And you noticed a palpable change as well. Maybe try to bring yourself and Stiofán here, if that's okay. Like, what do you see? Because you do a lot of work across the island and over in Britain as well. What are some of the main factors driving or fueling the growth of the far right?
Well, we make no mistake by thinking the growth of the far right's a recent thing. It's a product of neoliberalism. The far right's been on the growth internationally, particularly in Europe, since the early 1980s. There were 2-3% in the polls back in 82, they're now 15, 20, 30%. But it's been a steady growth. It's accelerated, of course, since 2008 and the global financial crash. And that's been kind of, like I said, the main accelerator for the growth, because that system fell apart in 2008 and it hasn't been put back together. It's not going to be put back together. And now we're like in permanent crisis, or permanent polycrises. There's just crises everywhere, environmentally, politically, economically, and the chaos that we're living through, and racism and growth of the far right is part of that chaos, is the next 20, 30 years. That's the unfortunate reality of where we are at the moment. So that's the one, when we do our political education work, to paraphrase Bertolt Brecht, we combat fascism as capitalism, because fascism is a product of the crises in capitalism. And because capitalism is in permanent crisis, fascism is here to stay. And those are the choices we have. It's back to Rosa Luxemburg's old missive of socialism or barbarism, and it looks like barbarism's winning at the moment. So that's the problem we have. And one quick example, then I'll stop. We're with the RMT next week, the week after next, me and Sean, who's down there somewhere, in London, doing 2 days on the far right, because they're concerned about their members voting for reform, as millions of workers across Europe are voting for far right populist and fascist parties, millions of trade union members. Now, in that 2 days with the RMT, we'll speak about reform on the far right for about 5% of the time. 95% of the time, we'll be talking about capitalism and imperialism, its history, where it is now, its crises, and what comes next. Because that's the talk we need to be having with people. Systemic talk about the next 20, 30 years. So that's where we are. So their rise isn't recent, and we shouldn't just focus on the far right. It's a very liberal kind of middle class idea that we should just talk about bad men and bad people. It's very kind of moralizing and hand-wringing. And we need to talk about the system that creates it and how we change that system.
I'll pick up a couple of things in a second. Azadeh, do you want to come in on that? This growth of the far right?
Yeah, I'm just listening to both of you. It was very interesting. And I thought to come from this positionality of a racial justice activist and an academic who has spent a few years researching on Islamophobia and racialization. What I want to say, which is probably is not going to be comfortable in most spaces, particularly the institutional spaces, is that anti-racism was neutralized and contained far before than being done by the far right, by the state itself. And what do I mean by this? The increasing way by the state to manage racial inequality, it became as a governing doctrine, not to challenge the racialization, but how to manage and govern this conflict, how to increase attention while at the same time denying that racism is a structural feature of the state. You can see this in anti-racist strategies created by governments of, for example, Britain, During 60s, you had this mass struggle for anti-racism, which was deeply intertwined with Black power and anti-imperial politics. Gradually, this anti-racist struggle was contained and absorbed and managed by the formal politics, and then the space was created for professional anti-racists, who were commentators, advisors, and consultants. So the space was given to speak about anti-racism with a condition. You can talk about anti-racism as long as you don't challenge the economic and political order that has produced it. So what I want to say is that far before we look at the far right as a reason of the situation, we have to go back to the state, because the state curtailed the radical anti-racism in Britain and in a wider region. And this is where we come to this diversity regime that we have to celebrate. Look at the terminology that this diversity regime uses. Cultural identity, ethnicity, minority, non-white. It all comes from from a white gaze. Why should I be seen as a non-white person? I refuse to see myself in opposition of a normative structure that seems the default feature of a human being. I refuse to see myself as a minority. The whole diversity paradigm has been created to disable radical anti-racism. And this is the reason I think we need to understand how strategically this has brought us to this point, and that the far right is more of a symptom than the cause. Because the far right would not advance if there is no mainstream politics behind it. The far right advances because the mainstream political parties harden the borders, continue deportation, while at the same time celebrating anti-racism. Mm-hmm. And the situation in Northern Ireland is even worse. You have the complete silence, if I don't want to say complicity, by major political parties, particularly the unionist parties here. This Islamophobic, anti-Black, anti-Muslim, racialized discourse that these parties have engaged in. Did I speak too?
Keep going.
Yeah. I have known many anti-racist activists, particularly in the context of Belfast, that have not spoken a single word about genocide in Palestine for over the past 3 years. So my question is your anti-racism engaged with interconnected linkages of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy, or is it just a way for you to feel good about yourself? Is it a white saviorism, a charitable cause, or actually you're seeing that racism is at the core of colonialism, and what is happening in Palestine is a clear image of how you have anti-racist politics which completely remain silent, particularly in places that is too costly for them to speak about.
Brilliant. I suppose looking at, delving into the kind of minutiae around the big picture of this, about how these tropes, these kind of anti-immigrant racist messages are gaining traction within communities and the vehicles that are used to kind of do this. And I'm thinking about, say for example, social media, and how social media has been used as a platform really not to only amplify messages, but to actually, and we'll go into this a wee bit, I think when we're looking at the responses and developing response, but really to kind of organized anti-immigrant movements in communities as well. what are those type of factors, looking at that are allowing anti-immigrant messaging, or far right, and I'm using that term because I don't have another catch-all term, but allowing these kind of messages to get traction in communities. Stefan, do you want to maybe touch on some of that?
Yeah, such a massive question. I'll try and be quick.
Don't worry about being quick.
The internet and social media is a part of the internet, of course. It's the bit we think about when we mention the internet. The internet's privately owned. 90% of the internet, its infrastructure, its chips, its software, the data centers, the cables that connect them are owned by a few billionaires on the planet. They also own social media. Those billionaires lined up behind Trump in his inauguration, so you know where they're coming from. The kind of the liberal coverage fallen off those tech companies. All of the rainbow flags have disappeared from their headquarters, and now they're openly imperialist and capitalist and fascist. In terms of social media, we knew even before Musk bought Twitter that Jack Dorsey, the great liberal billionaire, they were suppressing left-wing content and amplifying right-wing content. That's been going on for the last 12 or 13 years. Musk, like Trump, is just saying the quiet part out loud for the first time. So he's kind of doing us all a favour to remind us what's really going on. And so the internet and social media is hostile terrain for the left. They get promoted, their stuff gets spread more than ours does. But the other part of that story is that social forces of the right, whether it's a political party, whether it's a social movement, whether it's a kind of fascist network, they're really good at the internet. They're really good on it. They've got 10 or 15 years head start on where we are. They're well funded, they're efficient, they're disciplined, and they know that it works. So the AfD last year in Germany, their vote went up to 23-24%, particularly in Eastern Germany. The biggest shift in their vote was in the 18 to 24 demographic. They call it the TikTok election. Their game was really good. They were really good on TikTok. They had a massive kind of targeted messages for particular audiences. And someone told me that the AfD have 70 people working full-time on their socials. If you ask that an equivalent political party here or a trade union movement, they'll say, oh yeah, there's a wee lad comes in every 2 weeks and knocks us out a tweet. Or we've got this really good girl, she comes in, she's an intern, she makes us a little TikTok and it's great. I mean, we don't take it seriously. It is hostile terrain. It's a bit like being on a battlefield looking uphill. They're on top, it's their battlefield. We're down the bottom, up to our knees in shite. But it's a site of dominance, yes. It's also a site of contestation. There's space within that place for us to move. But what's our response? Oh, I'm leaving Twitter, like some self-sacrifice that you're making. And all you're doing is ceding ground to them. That's what you're doing. You're just leaving the battlefield and they take control. So our response has been worse than useless. We have no presence on the internet. They're all over it. And we need to really take seriously our kind of digital capacity and digital resilience in fighting back. Now, this doesn't replace normal organising, but it is in addition to it. And our response, whether political, social movement or trade unionism, apart from the odd example that I could find, is broadly speaking kind of rubbish. Doesn't even begin to describe how bad we are, not even in our presence on the internet, but even our analysis of it. So there's so much more work to do in that space.
What is it that makes that messaging find traction in some communities and not in other communities?
Well, there's two things. One is they're quite well disciplined and organised, and two, there's the material conditions that people live in. I mean, people's material conditions have collapsed in the last 15 years, and people are looking around for answers to explain why the material conditions have collapsed. The left, broadly, whether it's online or offline, looks as if they're defending the status quo. The left is defending the European Union, it's defending capitalism and neoliberalism. It's saying, don't worry, everything's okay. Everything's not okay. And working people in these streets know that, so they're looking around for an answer. And the far right's just stepping into that space online or in this community saying, look, we've got the answer, and it's there for. It's very simple, it's always strict in a book, punch down, don't look up. And our response, someone, this is Joe actually, in the audience says, the right end up looking like the radicals in this position, and we end up looking like the conservatives, because all we've got to offer them is fucking social democracy or liberalism or one of these political philosophies that's failed, and there's dying around us. So that's the issue there, is that people want to hear a story, they want to believe in something. We've got no story to tell them anymore.
Twasul, go ahead.
Yeah, for social media, I think in our work, for example, when we think of using social media, I think the big difference between us and the far right, for example, is our main concern is to protect people. Like, we work with people every day and they have million stories, and we know that telling the human story might bring people to think more about this and like be more kind to migrants and all. But then you think million times before you are recording someone's face and putting them in camera. And like when we worked in the hotels and we had big meetings, we always had like invited authorities and people from the departments and like media and everyone, and we asked people who were in the hotels to tell their stories, and people did. Like people will be telling their stories every time on the stage, like terrible stories, the stories of them being in the hotels, but also the stories of them back home and the terrible things that happened to them during the journey. And for us as organizers to do that, it's always like you feel a bit of responsibility, like you are causing people to repeat their trauma again and again. And it's the same on social media. You can tell people to tell their stories if it's a bad stories, or if it's a bad stories, then it means you are asking people to repeat the trauma, and you might be putting them in harm, because then their faces are known and they might be attacked. So it's tricky for us, not as easy as for the far right to use social media, and we also hate it, I think. We like organizing with people like on the ground.
I would like to mention about the importance of looking at the connection between the far right and loyalist paramilitaries in Belfast. So it allows us to move beyond the individual understanding of a person who is racist because of poor training or lack of cultural sensitivity, or just not receiving enough education. Because the good relation strategy in this country and the discourse created around that completely has a pathologic perspective, looks at racism as an individual disease that we have to cure, rather than as a state-figured structural problem. And here comes the connection with loyalist paramilitaries, that in a lot of communities in Belfast, you continue to have them functioning as brokers with the state, as arbitrators in fights, and also as gatekeepers and people who actually control the resources that enter those communities. So in a way, you have this double bind, that the people who are supposedly receiving the resources to protect the communities are also the people who are harming the communities. And the state has allowed this to continue. And it's hard to believe this is not by design. So I would like to go back to a few projects that I have seen through my own work as urban regeneration officer, that how they failed on a ground level. One project is in Shankill. The fundings in Shankill, the peace divide and funding in Shankill, if you speak to the residents, they would often tell you that it was a failure of programming because they were short-term, because they were tailored around the need of the funders rather than the priorities of the residents. And also they were depoliticized, which you would see around the mainstream peace projects in this city. Another problem that I would think is important to look at is how paramilitarism has been seen as a problem of individual person, and the programs that have been created were aimed at de-radicalizing individuals, rather than looking at the connection with the land, with the labor, and with the housing. So the collective problems of the community and the problems which have colonial roots, they were completely covered by seeing that we have to de-radicalize this individual person who was part of a military. And that was another problem which never really addressed the root causes of the conflict here, and the same problem is now reproduced in far-right mechanisms, their alliances with paramilitaries, and how they are basically controlling the neighborhoods. They are controlling the shops, the stores, the businesses, and it's far more than possible that these are all a design strategy rather than an ad hoc basis.
Thanks. I want to kind of just ask you all about sort of sites of resistance, really, and movement building around this stuff, and maybe then open it up for a bit of a conversation. But I suppose bringing it back to, we're talking about the 6 counties and localized stuff, but back to August 2024, whenever they had that kind of first anti-immigrant rally in Belfast that then spilled into the riots for a number of days when they tried to go down to the markets as well. And really for a period of, during the ensuing year, you went through a series of attempts to do critical mass events in town centres or city centres, where they would try to organise anti-immigrant sentiment. That was largely dwarfed by the counter-protesters each time they did it. So it was a failure in the sense that they failed to kind of coalesce into some sort of unified movement around this. However, they were still hitting the headlines. You know, they were able to keep the kind of narrative going, particularly online. And then we had the events in Ballymena, which I don't want to rehash, everyone will know that. But following Ballymena, you saw, and we tracked this online, but you saw a definite change of tactics by the anti-immigrant movement here, where they stopped trying to do mass mobilizations in city centres and really went towards hyper-local activities in communities under the banners of concerned residents, concerned citizens, whatever, that only really took a handful of people to actually pull off, but they're able to kind of profile their activities. So you started getting these kind of very, very localized action that seemed to be hitting local issues as well, but that were in some ways federated or networked. And now we're going through a period, I think, where they're trying to coalesce again and bring it together. The point is, though, there was a definite change of tactics. Whether it was coordinated or not, there was a definite playbook being adopted, where they were attacking churches, continual attacking homes. One of the things which I think Azadeh hit on as well is following the Ballymena, there was a more explicit crossover with Ulster loyalism and the anti-immigrant sentiment, and a lot of the pretense of we're all united together, Catholic and Protestants against immigrants, that kind of lost some of the traction that it had before, and they're sending to be. So I suppose when we're thinking about how do we combat this, like just in terms of your own work, now I'm thinking about it from 2 perspectives, right? One is, what are migrant communities doing in terms of self-organizing? Because I think that kind of community can, in terms of, lose its agency in the sense of thinking they just need to be supported somehow, but actually they're doing some serious organizing as well. And then just thinking about yourself, Stefan, some of the work that you do with unions. So what are the kind of local institutions or organizations doing to support that efforts, or also trying to combat the rise of anti-immigrant sentiment within their own ranks? So even some of the stuff you're doing with unions and the tactics, can you give us kind of a bit of insight into that, and in terms of also how impactful do you think it's been?
Yeah, I've got a very short answer to what unions are doing to combat the rise of the far right, and I say this as a trade union, so you're doing fuck all. That's the truth of it. In Ireland, it's probably worse than it is in Britain, I think, in terms of trade union initiatives to do anything realistic, I think, about it. They seem to be mostly just afraid of their own membership, so therefore they don't raise the topic. They're afraid of what their members are what they're going to hear from their members. That's the reality of it. So there's a real kind of stasis in the labour movement. The same is for Europe as well. The European Union, we work with big federations in Europe, and it's the same issue before. They don't really want to address the root causes of racism, because the root causes of racism, of course, is the collapse in neoliberal capitalism. They basically are supporters of that system. We made a deal back in the 80s, the Social Democrats and the Labour movement, that we would just manage this system on behalf of capital. That system's fallen apart, and now the unions don't know what to do. They're just rabbits in the headlight, I think. And so that's really an issue. So to be honest with you, we're not doing very much at all.
I'm just thinking, they're asking you to come in though. So there is an awareness at some levels of the structure that they need to do this. Where's that
coming? They're panicking because their members are voting in their millions for far-right parties.
Okay.
That's the reality, and that's having an impact on union membership, on union direction. And when you go in, of course, to talk about the rise of fascism, racism, populism, whatever, and you start talking about capitalism, and you start talking about the European Union and the structures of that organisation, you start talking about it, then they go, well, we didn't ask you to come in and talk about that. We just wanted you to talk about the bad men that are recruiting our members. And our philosophy is this, I mean, fascism is not a working class phenomenon. It's a ruling class project. In order for that project to succeed, they need to recruit our members to that project. They need to recruit the people in these streets to that project, and it's working. And unions and the left more broadly, I use that in the broadest possible sense, have no answer yet to that recruitment of our people to their project. They're winning that recruitment process with populist appeals, with encouraging people to punch down rather than look up, by attacking migrant people, for all the various tactics they're using, whether it's mainstream media, online, in our streets. And our response, broadly speaking, on the left has been actually to tack to the right every now and again. You saw that here with Sinn Féin did it after November 2022 with the East Wall. They sort of tacked to the right on immigration, didn't work, so they've tacked back again. And that's a danger. The left has to decide what it stands for, and then can stand there and represent something. As I made the point before, people are looking for something to believe in, and they're simply not hearing it from us.
Before we move on, do you tell us, so just to follow up something, Stefan, so outside the trade unions, are you seeing a sign of hope of any good initiatives where things are starting to kind of move in the right directions?
I'm going to be deadly downer for the day, aren't
No, I mean, honestly, genuinely.
In the entirety of Europe, there's one left-wing government, Spanish government.
Yeah.
Yes, and they wouldn't be left-wing if the Communist Party weren't in there pulling to the left, I think. Across Europe, every single country in Europe has a fascist, neo-Nazi populist party in the top two now. And they're in government in 4 or 5 different governments. In Italy, they were in government in the Netherlands, they're in Austria, they're in Hungary, they're in Poland. The far right are everywhere, and they're not just on the streets, which is bad, they're in government. They're in the police force, they're in the military.
Yeah.
That's where, and where's the left in all of that? It's kind of nowhere. That's the reality of the position. In Europe alone, almost Latin America and other parts of the world where there are good stories emerging and stuff, but in Europe, things need to change the tack, really.
Okay.
And at the moment, we're simply not at the game.
Okay. Twasul?
So when the riots happened in 2024, one of the things I thought were really good at that time is we have been organizing with refugees and asylum seekers for a few years before that. So when the riots happened, it meant we know what to do with people. We already had the relationships, we already had the trust with them. We built this relationship over the year. When it happened, there were a few hotels in Botanics, like Duke's Hotel and Ibis Hotel, when there were asylum seekers. And these are some of the hotels there who were attacked during the riots. And because we were working with families in these hotels, like we met with them regularly, we listened to their problems, and we helped them write complaints, send them to the authorities. And many of them got solutions to their problems. Many families got moved from these hotels, and the ones who stayed had relationships with the one who moved. So people were already trying to feel their power. Because when asylum seekers come here to the UK, they think they lost all the power they have, because they are completely in the hands of the Home Office and MIRS, which is a private company managing the contracts for the Home Office. And people don't get a proper orientation of how the systems work here. All they get is threats and intimidation. Like when we started working with people in the hotel, first time when we were trying to ask people to write complaints about the problems they have, everyone was scared, because MIRS tell people, first, people don't know the difference between the Home Office mails and the hotel staff. So all of them, to an asylum seeker living in the hotel, just represent the Home Office. So everyone is the Home Office. And the Home Office controls asylum seekers' life, because they can reject or agree to the asylum claim. So, and this is the most important thing, people gave everything to come here. So the most important thing for them is to get their leave to remain, and they are ready to give away everything just to get their leave to remain here. And when someone from MIRS or even a receptionist at the hotel tell you that if you complain, your asylum claim will get rejected, it means you will just keep a low profile, say yes to everything, never complain about anything. People are treating in an undignified way, they are giving the meals in a humiliating way, and they are living under very restricted conditions in the hotels. In some of these hotels, if you follow us on social media, you will find we brought up the posters they were beating in the hotels. People weren't allowed to use the lifts, for example. People are living in hotels, and the hotels are being paid, so they should be treated as residents of the of the hotels, but they weren't allowed to use the lifts. Like at some point you will meet a disabled child and a mom who has to carry the child up the stairs because they are not allowed to use the lifts, and it says lifts are for staff only. Like crazy conditions in the hotels. People weren't allowed to have visitors in the hotels, weren't allowed to stay a night out. Like some people will know people here, like relatives or friends, and they might want to go and stay the night, but they're not allowed to. They lose their right to the accommodation if they leave and stay out the night. So very like detention-like conditions, and it takes all like the control from you. You feel like you can't control anything, you don't have any power. But because we were working with people and we were working with them collectively, so people will come together and talk about these problems. And then whenever someone sends a complaint and then get moved or get an interview in the media and like see the support they get from people, they feel their power and they feel that they can do something and they can resist this. So when the riots started, we went and met with people who were in the hotels. And because we have our Kind Economy project already running, and the Kind Economy came from the Lift the Ban campaign, which is a campaign to, like I'm going circles here, I think, the campaign to lift the ban on asylum seekers work, because asylum seekers are not allowed to work also, and they stay in these hotels and take only £8 per week for person when they are in the hotels. So Kind Economy campaign came from that, because we have been asking the authorities for years and years and to change this and allow asylum seekers to work. And you know, because it's immigration is reserved, so everyone in Northern Ireland will say they support us, but they can't do anything. It's up to Westminster and all of that. So at some point we started the Kind Economy, which is just a different way of doing this. Instead of asking the authorities every time and get the same answer, starting to do this with communities like we do. It's a Kind Economy project is working with asylum seekers who come here with the skills and qualifications but are not allowed to work. So providing a platform for them to show their skills and contribute to the community. And part of it is the Kind Economy Kitchen, which is the most popular one. We have a few projects in the Kind Economy, but because it's food, it's always brings people. And so we work with chefs from different countries who are skilled chefs, but they can't work here. So what they do is they cook food from their countries, and we offer it to different places and organizations, and we get donations which then go back to asylum seekers who live in hotels or in houses, and they need the money. So when the riots started and we were trying to support families in the hotels, we already had connections with the local community. Like we had more than 200 organizations and people in our Kind Economy network. So people who were doing different kind of support. Like at some point we had families up in the mountain in the Standing Stone Hotel. And if you have been to that hotel, it's up the mountain. It has no access to transport, away from schools, no shops, no restaurants. So they put a refugee family there with kids, for example. They can't go to school because the bus is far away. They can't cook, there is no kitchen. They can't afford food in the hotel because it's too expensive. They have no washing machines, they can't wash the kids' clothes. But we had families from West Belfast who stepped up and helped families with lifts to schools, with washing their clothes, with providing places for them to wash their clothes and cook for their families and all. So different kinds of support coming from different organizations. We have art centers like the MAC, like the Golden Thread, just different centers who are helping families also with workshops for the kids, providing places for the families just to come have a space and all. So all these organizations helped us after the riots because they opened their spaces for people. We organized a few meals for people in the hotels because the same like with the protests in the Marine Court and Chimney Court, also police and the authorities are doing, are asking asylum seekers to stay in, being trapped in the hotels, and they are the victims, but they are being treated as the criminals. They are the ones being imprisoned to protect them, they say, but they are not protected. Like when we talk to families in the Duke's Hotel during the riots, everyone was scared. Kids had to watch violent people in the street trying to break into the hotel, smashing windows and threatening and very bad language. People were scared. When we organized the first meal after the riots, we organized it in a church close to the hotel, but we still had to escort people to the church because people were scared to step out. But because we had the relationships, we had the trust, it meant people felt more power. So we actually took people to the counter protests, and it was scary even for me to take them. If you remember, I think a few of you were in there, and we took a few from other campaign we are working with Anonymous Collective, which is a campaign to support young people who come to the UK after the age of 16 and they are denied education because they can't go to high schools and they can't apply to universities because they don't have enough English. We have more than 200 of them campaigning and working with us to get a model for education just for them. And we met them after the riots too. Sorry.
Great
Okay,
crack,
just
awesome.
end.
Great crack.
Yeah. They went to with
Kirsty,
us to
gonna
the
go on?
counter. Sorry.
So much interesting things to share.
No, I'll tell you what, we're going to open up for some questions, because I think we've got about another 5 minutes. Is that okay? No one's here. The adults aren't in the room. All right, so we'll just take about 3 questions, okay? Kieran first, and then yourself. Sorry, Kieran, go first there.
Yeah, Carl, part of that was excellent. The overall purpose of the Winter School Visitors this hour here is to bring the debate around Irish unity and what that might mean to communities like this, and also the tag issues that are important to us, including anti-racism and issues that, for us, we feel are largely absent from the broader debate around the future of the country and the constitutional question and stuff on other platforms. And I think, something within that debate we're hearing, in terms of the new constitutional framework and around, for instance, providing special protections to the unionist community within the new constitutional framework. Our view would be, well, what about people in direct provision? We'll give special protections for them. What about our immigrants in the refugee community? We'll provide special protections for them. And I suppose, do you see that, Stevie had mentioned around giving people something to believe in, and yourself, Azadeh, you talked about, moving from this diversity, anti-racism linked stuff, which is very firmly comfortable within existing economic structures, to something more robust, something more progressive, something more challenging. Do you see the debate around unity as an opportunity to reframe something?
Right.
And also in terms of what we can do around follow-up meetings to try and join the dance with our newcomer communities, our refugee communities, and locate them within the debate around unity and how we bring that forward.
Brilliant, Kieran. Thanks.
Well, first of all, that was an absolutely brilliant discussion. That was wonderful. That's a lot. But could you just comment very briefly on the role of divide and rule, but also class, and could you say something as well about GBTB and its toxicity affecting people's minds?
Is there another one? Chris?
More.
And then Maura. Sorry, Maura, go ahead first.
Thanks very much, Phil. And I don't mean to be as pessimistic as you are, but I worked for years in STEM, and we worked in the British government, British Home Office, in terms of asylum seekers and refugee and supports. I have to say, disgrace in terms of how they managed the EU settlement scheme. But I think here, in terms of the North, we need to hold our Human Rights Commission and our racial equality, those institutions to account as well, because they were agents for, and continue to be agents for, the British government's racist immigration policies, and we need to challenge that as much as we need to challenge people like Nicola Martin and those other political parties and institutions in the South. I think that has to be done.
Thanks.
Part of medieval.
Yeah.
In terms of bringing down.
Brilliant, Maura.
We need to get our own. We need to take these nice liberal middle class institutions who are very well funded and do all that so-called, good relations stuff, and they're not doing it.
Yeah. Thanks. Chris, we'll just take on them. We'll take it Go ahead.
Okay.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, just Steve, 2 points I thought were excellent on leading the question. One was the point you made about people making a show, I'm leaving Twitter, it's become toxic. Does any of that really impact on Elon Musk and the right-wing agenda? No, it doesn't. If you leave the stage and you do not engage, you're losing. So that was number one. And number two, which I thought was really important, you're making the point, I think it's a home run point to say it's actually the global economic order that is the problem. And I think that's a very important message to activists, because a lot of people who'll be on the ground and see over there in Beachman, see in other areas where I hear, I'm a principal in this area in West Belfast, I hear racist sentiments regularly, to be blunt. I think it's more because of the dominant political force within the nationalist and Republican communities. We have not had what we have in loyalist areas. I think that's a tribute to people, the culture of the area. But time moves on, and a worry I would have is that this is a window of time that we have. So the argument you made, I would just question or ask to know, the left needs stories. And I think you made a point, this lady made a point, and it's an excellent, the kind economy story, getting that out, the Muslim sisters of Ireland, is wonderful what they do. But is it not also part of the left's agenda to be more, I think, radical on housing? Why are they not arguing across Ireland that there should be fundamental, that should be the core issue? Because we need to look practically at what is leading people in working class areas to fall into the trap of racism.
Brilliant, Chris, thanks. So I'm going to take three things here. I'm going to merge Chris's point with the point here around class issues as well, but who wants to take the first issue? So what Kieran was talking first was, I suppose, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but what opportunities are presented by the unification debate to probably bring in stronger protections for migrant communities around this? Anybody want to go ahead, Azadeh?
Thank you for your question. I would say anti-racism in Ireland will fail. Anti-racism in United Ireland will fail if it's not decolonial. And unification will fail if it is not anti-racist. These two futures are inseparable. And the reason I think we need to be aware of the interconnection between them is to know, when we talk about anti-racism, is our anti-racism anti-colonial as well or not? And at the same time, how do we understand the unification? Is it just a matter of the border going away and continuing, in a way, reorganizing the same structure and the same system that reproduces inequality and discrimination and minoritizes and racializes communities? So I would see very much that interconnection in what you mentioned. And I think we would need a structural shift. It wouldn't be happening without a transformative grassroots hover. And I'm quite hopeful on that, because the way I saw, for example, in the recent presidential election in Ireland, how thousands of grassroots organizers and volunteers came out to basically send a message that we need a radical housing politic. And that radical housing politic is connected to our politics on racism and to our politics internationally on Palestine and neutrality and elsewhere. Something I found problematic in current anti-racist organization in Belfast is it's very reactional. We don't really have a political strategy. If there is an uphill in a place, we suddenly bring 15,000 people in the streets. But if there is nothing on the surface, then we don't care about the hidden structural issues.
Does anybody else want to come in on that?
I think in terms of the unification debate, there's a couple of issues. One is, in order for it to succeed, it has to be a broad-based left campaign that includes all of the various parties, including those aspects of unionism that are most resistant. The danger, if that doesn't happen, and if that doesn't happen, it's going to be a debate between the British ruling class and the Irish ruling class, and the new Ireland that emerges will be the same as the old Ireland. We'll just have unzipped the border and we'll have bolted together two failed states under the European Union, and the implications of what that means in terms of genuine national sovereignty. What that means, that's maybe a debate for another day. The other issue there is, I think, that there's a potential blockage in that road to United Ireland, and that's the right of the far right in the Free States. There is a Free State mentality, there is a Free State politics, a Free State culture that's deeply partitionist. Now the polls say 65-70% of people in 26 counties want a United Ireland. That's dropping. And because the far right in Ireland is very much rooted in that Free State mentality, and let's keep partition. This is our little state, we like our little state, and we don't want that, whatever the fuck that is up there. So that's a genuine threat to reunification, is the growth of the far right in the south. Now, if and when that happens, whether it's going to be an independent movement, whether it's Fine Gael tacking to the right and becoming that populist far right movement, but being there in the past, of course, you don't know. But it's still a big threat to that project. It's probably actually a bigger threat, I think, than unionism in terms of that unification process.
Yeah. What about the class issue that both Chris and this they talked about as well?
Because one of the things that, if you could elaborate a bit on this, is if you look at, say, the British government, both parties, Tory and Labour, you have the likes of Kevin Bannock, you have the likes of David Lammy, and they legitimise racism.
That's the beauty of populism. It allows you to do anything you want. That's why it's such a useful tactic for modern political parties. In terms of class, unless there's a broad-based socialist and Republican movement behind and united for United Ireland project, in the words of James Connolly, it's just going to be old wine in new bottles. Nothing fundamental will change on this island.
Yeah.
And undipping the border it's not even the beginning of a process. It's no process at all, actually, for changing what needs to change on this island.
Yep. The point being made about the institutions, so the Human Rights Commission, Equality Commission, all the, I suppose, the institutions that were erected as part of the peace agreement here. Yeah, I think it may be a way of looking at it is in terms of Twasul, in terms of the work you're doing. Do you even see them as relevant?
And like, it's not like we didn't try. We tried, like whenever we supported and worked with families and people in the hotels or in different places, we always, like, we sent thousands of complaints to all of these like commissioners. And at some point they actually asked us to stop. They said it's not, it's not relevant to them. And it is relevant to them, like the Human Rights Commissioner is a Children and Young People Commissioner, and we send them reports of people not getting food, not getting education. Like in the hotels, we had children who were completely out of education because most hotels are in areas where there is no access to schools. Or at some point, because Mears, the private company, decided it's more convenient for them to keep kids out of school until they move them to a house, because they didn't want all the hassle coming with kids moving from one school to another and them paying for school uniform and all. They worked with the Education Authority, which is responsible of kids' education. They worked with a private company, Mears, to stop schools who were kind enough to accept kids who were in school. We had a school who accepted kids from a hotel and sent them a bus every day to get them. And like Education Authority and Mears stopped that school from registering the kids. And this is just how they behave. Like.
I'm going to give the last word to yourself, Azadeh. Whatever you want to say.
I would just come back to what you say, this famous saying that you can dismantle the master's home with master's tool. I see Human Rights Commission a master's tool.
Sinead? Can I just thank everyone? I thought it was fun. Oh, you go ahead. No, you do it. You do it. Go ahead.
This is amazing. Thank you so much. We in Guatemala are going to be organising around this. If anybody wants to join us, keep an eye on our social media. There's going to be an open meeting for people to come, because what we've seen is there's lots of different people organising around anti-racism work. What we want to do is bring everyone together and have experts who can guide us and put some strategy together to work together going forward. I also wanted to say there's stalls, I never mentioned this earlier, we've got different campaigns. There's stalls here and there's some up the stairs just on the balcony. Go around and have a wee look at some of the local grassroots campaigns.
The one we second, can I just say, when Twasul was talking, she talked about that kind of network of the kind economy, and that involves everything from schools, the businesses, the community organizations all coming together in a kind of wider network. You can join that, and you can get your organization to join it. Maybe Glónamona can put out a link to it so that people are working in organizations that can join the Conal Economy Network. We can do it after this.
Yep.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Gormain,